Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
Imagine coming home and seeing your wife holding the hand of another man. In that moment your world is crumbling, but there is an even more amazing and healing journey ahead that will change everything. Today's story with a similar plot. Enjoy! I met Janet on the porch at Adams Morgan one steamy summer night in Washington. It was a typical summer day. The heat and humidity were over 100, and I was soaked through. No one in their right mind would stay in Washington in July. No wonder the creatures in Congress run away for a 5-week vacation. But my graduate commitments kept me tied to this place, so I stood there suffering. It was damn painful. The District of Columbia was created from lands given by the states of Maryland and Virginia, and our selfish founders would never have given away land suitable for agriculture. Instead, they gave the country an excellent piece of swamp near the Potomac, and although the area is now being developed with expensive real estate, the essence of the pristine quagmire is still felt. Two things immediately stood out to me about my future wife. First, she was lying on a shabby sofa on the veranda, clearly drunk, which promised a solution to my dryness problem. I was going through a long period of stagnation in my intimacy life, so romance was the last thing I needed. It may seem superficial to be attracted to a woman because of her breasts, but as they say, you can't remember personality. She had a sweet, oval face, not beautiful but pleasant, and very thick brown hair that flowed down her back in waves. She had an incredibly mouth with very full and expressive lips. Movie stars pay fortunes for lips like these. She wasn't unconscious or anything like that, it was just clear that her judgment might be seriously impaired. In short, she was exactly what I was looking for in a woman. I'm not a predator, I would never force a girl against her will. I'm just someone who usually needs a lot of alcohol to succeed. The fact is that I find it easier to get along with women if their powers of observation are reduced to such an extent that they do not notice my innate lack of subtlety. I sat down next to her. She smiled at me stupidly and hummed, "I was hoping you'd come talk to me." This was something new. Usually, when I sit down next to a beautiful girl, I hear, "You freak." I am average in every way, in height, weight, and appearance, and my approach to women really needs improvement. So, women usually decide that life is too short to waste time talking to me. But that one actually said she hoped I would talk to her because it was new. I tried to put on my best Prince Charming face and said, "Do we know each other?" Damn, that wasn't very charming. She said in one of those fuzzy, drunken voices that indicate she's far gone, "I was in your cryptology class last year. Don't you remember me?" Wow, at least she saw me in my element, I thought to myself. Any woman who takes an advanced code-breaking class is a real nerd, and I'm the king of it. Maybe it will compensate for some of the factors I lack, such as looks, money, and intimacy appeal, not to mention some aspects of personal hygiene. Actually, this drunk little nerd might be the girl I've been looking for my whole life, but I still didn't remember her. I asked her what her name was, and she told me Janet Escu. I remembered Janet Escu, but that girl was about the size of a killer whale, and she had bangs that made her look like she had just stepped out of a 1950s Archie and Veronica comic book. This petite woman had a very slender and curved figure with magnificent breasts and was dressed as if she had graduated from Choate. I looked puzzled. She giggled stupidly and said, "You knew me before I lost weight. I had problems after my parents divorced, and I gained weight while I was in your class. It took a lot of therapy and a crash diet, but now I'm back to my normal state." I looked at her carefully a second time. She wasn't a beauty, but she was incredibly. She had the open, sweet girl next to her face and those aforementioned breasts, but she also had long, slender legs and nice round hips and tight jeans. Remember, we were sitting in the dark on the front porch outside of a loud party, and we met just a minute and a half ago. She surprised me by not slapping me, screaming, or running to the police. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment all her life. I don't believe in random luck, but it was a long dry time, so I was not in the mood to look for a catch. We heard people approaching in response to the noise, so we just sat there casually until half the party thundered past us and ran out onto the sidewalk looking for the source of the noise. She looked at me, I looked at her, and we both laughed. We spent about 15 minutes together, but I just knew I was going to marry this delightfully strange little woman. The next evening, we realized the inevitable. This happened during a night session as muggy as the weather in Washington. We got married just 4 months later and settled into a nice little apartment down the Red Line in Shady Grove. I know you're probably thinking it was stupid to get married so quickly, but Janet's charm really clouded my judgment. I should have suspected something if I had time to think about it, but Janet was so attractive, and I needed her so much. The first few months together were idyllic. I couldn't imagine a more compatible woman or a more satisfying lifestyle. She and I just got along well. We also did all the fun things you could think of in a city with unlimited entertainment options. Everyone thought we were the perfect couple. Some couples hang on each other in a wet, saccharine kind of love. Janet was a very smart woman, and our lives were built on our shared intelligence. We joked and teased each other. We passed puns around to each other like a good comedy couple, and in general, we shared a gentle, ironic view of the world. It was hard not to love a woman who saw irony and humor in everything she did. It was almost too good to be true, and of course, this was indeed the case. The first sign that change was coming came when I met her father. We got married in a quick civil ceremony, as is customary among nerds, but she pestered me for months to meet her father just to get his blessing. So we took the Acela train and headed to New York for the weekend. I knew her father lived in Manhattan. I didn't know it was overlooking Central Park in the 80s. It turned out that Dad made his money the old-fashioned way. He inherited it. And as Scott Fitzgerald said, the rich are different from you and me. Dad treated me with the same contempt that the lord of the manor would show to any disheveled old peasant his stupid daughter had just brought home. He seemed to expect me to reach for my forelock every time I addressed him. Long story short, I hated him from the moment we met. Janet also changed 180 degrees. She went from being open and friendly to being sarcastic and arrogant. It was clear that she thought the little people were inferior to her. Being one of the little people, I was stunned. It was also clear that the separation between her father and mother was the result of father's debauchery, and Dad didn't try to hide it. He clung to his right to seduce any woman he met with the same fanatical confidence with which Charles I must have had the divine right of kings. Unfortunately, I learned what this meant in the worst possible way. He drove us across the park to the Carlisle for dinner. This experience was so out of my control that I knew he had planned it simply to show me how sublime he was. Janet wore a tight little black dress and heels that showed off the goods. She turned heads everywhere we stopped. Both she and her father were the picture of a sophisticated New Yorker. I'm not very good. I didn't really do anything shameful, but I wasn't the star of the show either. Dad kept asking me about what I was doing, and I tried to explain to him about the offer I had just received from Georgetown. At first, it was the position of associate professor. This is not normal in academia. In fact, I had done very well in this regard. His response was to dismiss me as a teacher, which I think I was, but from the tone of his voice, it seemed that anyone could do this. But this is not the case. I definitely wasn't making the kind of money his daughter was used to, but I was well on my way to success in my chosen field. Later, I remembered all the consequences, but at the time, I felt inadequate and angry because I saw nothing in this man's own achievements that could justify his high opinion of himself, except, of course, that he was born into the right family. I was a little hurt that Janet didn't protect me, but I saw that she had daddy issues, and I loved her, so I was willing to give her the opportunity to communicate with her father. On the other hand, it did not increase my trust in her. I was also bothered by the way her father treated her. It was like she was his date, and what's worse, she allowed it, which didn't make me happy at all. They both got drunk. I pushed the two of them into a taxi, and we went back through the park to 86th Street. I was sitting in the front, and they were both sitting in the back. The next morning, the woman I knew as my wife magically reappeared. Her body language, voice, and behavior changed 180 degrees. It was as if she had taken off yesterday's image like a robe and hung it in the closet of her father's guest room. It was actually kind of creepy. We took a taxi to Penn Station, and she was as energetic and cheerful as ever. It was like casting out an evil spirit from our marriage, so I made a mental note to stay away from Templeton SQ. Janet's transition from one person to a completely different person would have bothered me if it had continued, but it was just a day, and it didn't bother me too much. That's how it should have been. The next 5 years flew by on blissful wings. The main feature of that period was the data compression algorithm that I came up with. Data compression is at the heart of computer vision, which has applications in everything from search engines to cruise missiles. So for us nerds, this is the holy grail. In my last days at GUO, I worked on an excellent lossless algorithm and perfected it 2 years later. I'm too naive to do actual production, but I had a friend named Scott who was a genius when it came to bringing products to market. So he did the heavy lifting, and I got 40% of the shares as a silent partner. Our first contract was with Rand almost immediately. The targeting system for their Turcom Smack block Roman 4 became much more capable, and my bank account became unimaginably larger. I'm a nerd. I don't care about money and don't know anything about finance, so I had Scott take care of it all, and I never discussed our financial situation with Janet. In my opinion, this would sound self-congratulatory, and nerds don't brag about how much they earn. Conquest points in World of Warcraft, yes, but never money. I just continued to live as if nothing had changed. Later, I was very glad that I did just that. Money was a blessing only because it gave me the freedom to do whatever I wanted for the rest of my life. I continued teaching and loved it, therefore, I retained my position on the faculty. But I did buy a house in Georgetown and paid in cash. Janet didn't seem to notice. I think she thought I was up to my eyeballs in debt. The only real change was that it was now easy to walk to campus. Janet herself went through a huge transformation. The 23-year-old girl I met that hot night in Adams Morgan was now a 28-year-old woman with a style I could only dream of. When I first met her, she was a sweet and bubbly girl, but as she approached her late 20s, her face became more refined, and her body rounded out. She was truly a magnificent-looking woman. She never asked about money, she just always had it. Accordingly, she mastered all the rich lady techniques, dressing, grooming, and fashion that differentiate the simply beautiful from the stunning. In fact, she was now many kilometers above me on the social ladder. Unfortunately for me, I am not that sophisticated or educated and never will be. I live mostly in my head and never wanted to be socially noticeable. My world is a bowed head in virtuality. It may be isolating, but it's the only place I'm truly happy. The good news was that my abilities and interests financed Janet's lifestyle. The bad news was that we started going in different directions. We may have been a perfect couple once, but now we were different people. Over time, we began to function in completely different areas. Janet was a woman who preferred black ties and the Kennedy Center. In my opinion, a good evening is sitting in Blues Alley. She liked the atmosphere at the Verizon Center. I really enjoyed the peace and quiet of our yacht on the Potomac. I think you can see where this is going, and it inevitably happened. Most of the time, we had a free and easy life, but it was obvious that we were no longer as closely connected, at least not in the same way as in the beginning. This manifested itself in occasionally tense conversations and a huge decline in the quality of our intimacy life. But I must confess that I did not see the torpedo coming until it actually struck. I realized that I seriously lacked sociability, and I knew some changes would be needed, but that was all I thought through. On the other hand, Janet had already completed this or perhaps had already checked out the door. I returned from class one bright sunny morning in May. The weather in Washington was in that short window of time where the term amazing best describes it. I placed my laptop bag on the hallway table, entered the living room whistling cheerfully under my breath, and stopped dead in my tracks, amazed by what I saw. Janet sat nervously on the couch, holding the hand of a tall, very good-looking guy. Templeton Eskew sat on the sofa opposite them. Every red light, horn, and alarm immediately went off in my head. Whatever is going to happen, it will be bad. Janet looked at me sadly and said the 5 words no husband wants to hear, "Jake, we need to talk." I stared at her. She looked worried. Templeton grinned. Who the hell is this other guy? Was he her lawyer? In fact, he really was Janet's lawyer, but he was also her lover. She said, "Jake, this really hurts me, but you need to know that I'm leaving you. I could just disappear, but I value the time we spent together and wanted to let you know personally." Damn it. I sat down in the nearest chair. I have no idea what was on my face, but my soon-to-be ex-father-in-law looked delighted. Was she leaving me? Where did this come from? I probably looked like the proverbial fish out of water. I babbled, "Are you leaving me? Why? What have I done? What will happen to me?" She showed fake concern and said, "You'll be okay. I know you're a strong person. It's just that Burton and I have found each other again, and we can't be apart." Templeton said with contempt in every word, "Janet and Burton have been together since childhood. He is the right man for her. Janet realizes that they should never have separated. Burton didn't actually cheat on her, he was just having fun. Now he's ready to settle down, and Janet has agreed to be his wife." I said sadly, "But she's my wife." Crap, listen to me, I sounded like a snotty little wimp. It was just humiliating. My father's raw humiliation and smug tone pushed me over the edge. I didn't know that I could do it, but Bruce Banner probably didn't think so either. I just got angry. I turned to my father, not trying to control the anger in my voice. "I'll rip your head off if you open your mouth again, you arrogant idiot." He began to open his mouth. I started to rise from the chair. He could see the real anger in my eyes, and he made a silent gesture with his finger to his lips. I turned to the treacherous ex, as if she was no longer my wife, and said, "Are you telling me that this worm is your former lover and that you are leaving me for him? How long have you been sleeping with him?" The aforementioned worm said in a very offended tone, "Now look here, old man." I turned to him and said, "Where I come from, you and I should be beating each other right this second. So unless you want to go to the parking lot, I advise you to stay out of it. This is between me and my future ex-wife." He just sat there in disgust. I turned to her and said, "Okay, cheater, over to you. How long has this been going on, and what do you propose to do next?" Janet looked stunned and very angry. She didn't expect this. She said, "Dad hasn't felt like you're the right person for me since our first trip to New York. He urged me to give Burton another chance. Burton came all the way here to accompany me to the Washington National Opera last November. This was the event that I refused to go to because it was too boring. I remember that she had a black tie party in the suite I bought for her at the Jefferson. I expected a scandal when I told her I didn't want to go. She came home the next day and was as sweet and loving as ever. I said, "So you've been having fun with him for 6 months?" She looked distressed and said condescendingly, "What humiliating words, Jake. This is not in your favor." But to answer your question, Burton and I became a couple from that night on. I'm surprised you haven't heard about this since we didn't hide our relationship. But then again, you don't travel in our circles. We want this to be permanent now, and I need you to set me free so I can marry the person I should have been with in the first place. I'm sure you understand that it's over between us. I love you, but I haven't been in love with you for a while." I looked at the traitor and her two-faced father. Then I turned my attention to the worm. I said, "So you want to marry her knowing what a she is?" He muttered, "Now look here, you can't talk about Janet like that." I said, "How can I talk about her? I gave her all the love and devotion that was in me. I gave her money so she could pretend to be a community elder. All I expected was to raise children with her and die in her arms. As a reward, she's been entertaining you for the past 6 months." They both exploded. I looked at them with murder in my eyes. They both fell silent. I calmly addressed everyone in the room without showing any anger in my voice. "Is this really what you all want?" The brat looked thoughtful, Dad looked outraged, and Janet looked serious. Janet said with anger in her voice, "This is what we all want, Jake. You have to let me go. I've already moved all my stuff to Burton's, and when I leave here, I won't be coming back. I don't need anything from you, just a quick divorce. Burton has a lot more money than you, so I don't need anything except your blessing." I looked at her, truly perplexed. The stupid girl really expected me to smile and say, "Okay, good luck with your life." Seriously? I couldn't imagine how someone could be so naive. I sincerely looked into their eyes and said, "I hope you all burn in hell." This caused everyone to gasp. After that, I got up and left the apartment. If I had stayed a moment longer, I would have killed every single one of them. I'm not usually impulsive, I think everything over in my head. So I walked along the shoreline to Key Park, trying to cool down. I sat on a bench and watched the planes slowly fly over Roslyn towards DCA Airport. It was a beautiful day, and my thoughts were racing wildly. I don't know how other people react to personal betrayal. I was stunned. I knew betrayal when I saw it, I just didn't know what to feel about it. There wasn't much pain, perhaps I didn't love her as much as I thought. However, there was now an emptiness in my soul. It was as if all the confidence drained out of me. I wasn't going to shed any tears for her, perhaps because I don't think lamenting about lost love is particularly manly. Obviously, she was not who I thought she was, and she made her choice. So be it. Her passing did not affect the rest of my life. In fact, in some ways, nothing significant has changed. I was still young and richer than I ever imagined. It was fortunate that Janet and her father despised me so much that they never took any interest in my financial affairs, a bad assumption in the information age. Take Bill Gates, for example. I knew two things for sure. First and foremost, I will never trust another person again. Against my better judgment, I gave my heart to Janet unconditionally, and look where it got me. So women can be crossed off the list of mistakes I won't make again in the future. Second, I needed to get out of here. Thanks to my algorithm, I could do whatever I wanted in life, and the last thing I needed was a reminder of how bad my existence had become. My life was already meaningless, so I should have a little fun. By the way, I walked back to the RAB station at G de la PL. St. Denis is often described as Detroit with couscous. Looking back at the destroyed buildings, I understood why. 20 minutes ago, I was standing at one of the third access levels of the tunnels at the Stade de France. From this vantage point, I could see about 80,000 of my fellow humans, what the French call football fans. But I didn't come here to watch the game. I took the RER to St. Denis to assess where I was in my recovery. It was a test of my mood, so to speak. Some go to church, some sit on the top of a mountain with their legs crossed and mutter OM. I come to sporting events to try to understand my place in the grand scheme of things. I like to see the big picture when I think about where I am, and there's nothing like a stadium full of people to get a useful insight into where you stand in relation to life. I looked at the backs of the heads in the countless rows in front of me. All I could see was a mix of hair. There was a variety of colors and lengths, but none of their owners stood out. They were invisible skins in a boiling sea of wool, most likely like a flock of lemmings. I shook my head and walked back down the steps behind me. The entire stadium erupted in applause as someone performed an epically heroic feat that would be replaced by another epically heroic feat next week. I sighed. At least I confirmed what I came to find out: insignificance is the human condition. I took the Paris Metro back to the FDR stop at the Arc de Triomphe, then walked back to the hotel. I stayed at the Hotel California in the 8th arrondissement. Check out this place, it's real. I wonder if the French understand the irony of the lyrics to the old Eagles song, "You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave." My location could not have been more suitable. I've been living in Paris for the last 4 months since the divorce became official. I needed to be anywhere but Washington, so I asked for a sabbatical to collect my thoughts. Not surprisingly, Georgetown was happy to give it to me. My classes this past semester really left a lot to be desired. Meanwhile, the deceiver became a prominent figure in the public life of Washington. It seems like her sharing with me was a debut of sorts. The happy couple looked disgustingly happy and very much in love. But the smiling photos of Janet and the worm in the Post's public news pages really spoiled my morning. She looked as arrogant as he did. Janet was clearly a chameleon. She could absorb and imitate the personality of whoever stood next to her. Her betrayal was hard to accept, but she was also clearly a complete psychopath. I think psychiatrists call it dissociative identity disorder. I first saw this when she transformed into a completely different person during our visit to her father in New York. I just didn't get it then. Whoever was living in her head at that moment probably didn't know the others existed. That's why she was able to deceive me for so long. But she was clearly 2, perhaps 3, completely different and separate individuals. Janet's main personality, which I suspect was her true one, was unassuming and warm, in contrast to the others, who were cold, calculating, cruel, and arrogant. The root cause of the various personalities living in her attic is undoubtedly related to some devastating event during her formative years. Her father was definitely causing the switch, so no doubt he was something important in her life. Regardless, Janet's situation definitely made me give up on women forever. What is a completely disillusioned and cynical nerd doing in a place like Paris, you ask? I'm not particularly sophisticated or worldly. The answer is familiarity. What happened with Janet had shattered all my inevitabilities, and I needed a reset, at least if I ever wanted to get back into the game of life. Until the moment my ex-wife dropped the bomb on my future plans, I was on a path that was probably set in the 3rd grade. I would study well, find a good job, marry a caring and faithful woman, and we would raise 1.86 children and die in each other's arms. It didn't work out so well, did it? So I went back to the drawing board for a new start, and I didn't want to reinstate myself in any environment even remotely related to my old life. I deliberately chose not to live with the British. It would be too familiar, and I didn't want any transferable assumptions. I wanted to get away from life as far as possible, and Paris is a pretty foreign place for a guy who is more at home at Comic-Con. But as Hemingway said, Paris is also a movable feast, and frankly, my move was doing its job. Every day, my old life faded further and further from my memory, and my self-confidence began to return. I would probably meet Bob Kahn en route to Berry at Le Fouquet's on the Champs-Élysées. We could watch the world pass by behind our pastis and baguette, but it was raining heavily. The city can be a romantic dream at some times of the year, but on this April day, it was cold, gray, and gloomy. Robert Kahn was one of a group of English-speaking expats who had settled into the Parisian scene. It was his way of avoiding doing anything adult and responsible in the States. We were all here because we were looking for something, and we moved in the same circles because of our common language. He was another guy who inherited rather than earned his fortune, but he was very tough despite everything. He was taller than me by a couple of inches, handsomer than Worm, and probably weighed about 220 pounds. He had played college football at Harvard as a linebacker and was the epitome of an alpha male, smart, arrogant, and a little more smug than Lou Roman at 15. For some reason, he almost followed me. In fact, not a day went by that he didn't call or ask to meet. I was pretty sure it wasn't because of my good looks and charm. Perhaps he was attracted by the world weariness that I simply exuded, or perhaps he had some idea of who I really was. At that stage, I was filthy rich. I know I didn't act or dress like a multimillionaire. I was still sticking to the nerd style rather than the La Dolce Vita lifestyle. But all of us nerds are like that. Money means absolutely nothing to us. That's why we don't monitor it. My stay in California cost serious money, but it was a drop in the bucket compared to how quickly it added up. The most expensive thing I owned was that almost doubled in value on paper, but I paid cash for it, so my only real connection was through the current tenant, and it only made me richer. When he walked through the street door of the small bar at the entrance to California, Kahn was dressed in the style of Ralph Lauren's preppy collection. He moved like a big cat. Gracefulness is the word that comes to mind. In fact, he was a really tough and dangerous guy, but since he always had money, he could afford to be careless, as if he had been born to illustrate the word. He was wearing a very expensive leather jacket paired with a black t-shirt. His thick, curly brown hair was covered with a fedora that looked like he had liberated it from Indiana Jones. The sparkle in his blue eyes allowed him to conquer women almost on demand, and he sparkled, addressing all the women in the bar. He walked up, shaking off the rain, and said, "Where were you today? I tried to change the meeting place, but you didn't answer your calls." I didn't want to tell him that I spent the day in St. Denis feeling miserable. I would sound like a coward, which I probably was. So instead, I told him that I had spent the day writing articles and didn't want to be disturbed. I actually wrote several articles for various magazines as an excuse for why I was in Paris. This seemed to satisfy him. He said, "I wanted to spend the evening at Bugsy's. Bill and Mike will meet us there." These two were also former military men. They served in the 173rd Parachute Regiment based in Italy and remained in Europe after their discharge. They lived together in a shabby apartment in the 18th arrondissement near Montmartre. Bill Gorton was a really tough guy. Mike Campbell had problems with PTSD. The Sky Soldiers, as they called themselves, faced significant challenges during their time in Iraq and the Logar province of Afghanistan. Mike struggled with the consequences of this. The rain stopped when we reached Rue de Berry. Bugsy's was less than a mile down Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, and it seemed pointless to take a taxi, even if you could get some arrogant Parisian taxi driver to stop for us. So we just walked for the 15 minutes it took to get there. Bugsy's was a cross between an American sports bar and some French take on 1920 Chicago. It was always crowded, mainly because it served the best cheeseburgers in the universe, and it was a place for Americans like Khan and me to visit. American tourists were everywhere at the legendary Harry's on Rue d'Anu. Given the drink prices there and the Midwestern clientele, I can't imagine the likes of Sinclair Lewis, Hemingway, or even the Duke of Windsor would be caught drinking there now. Tables were usually scarce, but Bill and Mike arrived earlier and held one for us. I knew they had been there for a while because Mike was already drunk. However, as we pushed through the crowd, my attention wasn't on my two friends. Khan and I both examined the woman sitting next to Mike. Words like magnificent don't really describe a woman like her. Every beautiful woman requires male attention, but this one was in a category of her own. It wasn't her looks that made her stand out. She radiated an exceptional, blazing that made you think of wildfires, pounding jungles, wild dances, and fertility goddesses. Some legendary actresses and models have this quality. I'd never experienced this before, but I immediately recognized it in her. Meanwhile, Khan seemed about to propose to her right there. We sat in the outside seats, with Mike leaning against the wall, his arm around the woman next to him. Khan beat me to it, taking a seat next to her. The woman looked at Khan with the same interested look a cat gives a tasty canary and said in a very well-placed voice from Belgravia, "Lady Brett Ashley." "Who are you?" Even sitting across the table, I was captivated by Lady Brett. She had perfectly balanced features, huge eyes, rosebud lips, a long, pointed aristocratic nose, and a white cascade of golden hair. She was dressed casually but expensively and wore enough gold to make Mansa Musa envious. Her $20,000 Rolex Yachtmaster with a diamond-set watch completed the ensemble. But it was her smoky gray eyes that held both Khan and me captive. They simultaneously conveyed a sense of generational superiority and obscene pagan mating rituals. Khan's tongue almost fell onto the floor like a classic cartoon wolf. He said, stuttering, "Robert Khan, at your service, my lady." I'd never seen him embarrassed in the presence of a woman. Mike brought her, but since he was out of shape, Khan became the new object of her attention, and he enjoyed it. She turned to me with the same cheerful, charged look and asked, "Who are you?" I said, "Jake Barnes, Lady Ashley. Khan and I are in the same boat as Bill and Mike." She laughed heartily and said, "You Americans have such a cute way of using archaic slang. Does this mean you are all fascinated by me?" This was accompanied by a searing glare that would make the Lord of Hell stand up. So I casually replied, "Some of us want to seduce you in the sense you mean, and some of us are just here for the cheeseburgers. You can't get a good burger in France except at Bugsy's." At that point, I excused myself and went to get beers for my friend and me, which were also great. The French are amazingly good at brewing beer. The bar had the usual crowd of people, so I had to be away for a while. I couldn't get anyone to serve me. It wasn't because I'm American, it's because it was Paris. All the waiters in town treated customers with the same dismissive, rude attitude. When I returned, Lady Ashley was leaning back against her companion while flirting with Khan on the other side. Lady Brett was the complete package, an outstanding face and an exceptional body. She was oriented towards Khan, leaning on Campbell's chest with her head on his shoulder. Some women might feel awkward about someone mindlessly grabbing their breast, but not Brett. She treated Campbell's actions as a tribute to her excellence. Khan couldn't take his eyes off her, and she gave him her full attention. I wondered if Campbell saw what was happening. Indeed, it was difficult to conclude that Lady Brett had many moral principles. I left my opinion alone because Brett was clearly open about her promiscuity, unlike some of the other sneaky women I knew. I put a beer in front of Khan. He looked at me with a sly smile and went back to seducing the lady. His devilishly carefree blue eyes sparkled with mischief. Gorton and I exchanged an amused glance as I sat down next to him. I knew he didn't think Mike was the sharpest knife in the drawer, but watching Khan try to win over Brett right in front of him qualified the guy for a Guinness World Record. I really liked Gorton. He had always been a paratrooper, trim and fit, mid-30s, and tough. But most importantly, he had a sense of humor, and this quality was always visible on the surface. He was practically laughing out loud at the virtual threesome that was happening on the other side of the table. With all the tension in the air, it was difficult to have a rational conversation, but I asked Gorton what they were doing anyway. He told me they were planning a trip to the Monaco Grand Prix in 3 weeks. He said, "We have a friend who has a boat there, and he invited us to join him. He says race cars drive right past where he's moored. It's going to be a party, man. Why don't you join us?" I wondered how Gorton had an acquaintance rich enough to take a premium seat at an event like this, but the two traveled a lot during their war days. Plus, they had this macho vibe, so it's no surprise that some rich amateur wanted to have them around as showpieces. It turned out that the man who owned the boat was Kuwaiti. This made the connection even more interesting, considering what Bill and Mike were doing in those parts. The more I thought about it, the more I liked it. I spent too much time staring at my belly button because of Janet, and never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that I would find myself in Monaco, especially at such a famous event as the Monte Carlo Grand Prix. I would never have gone there myself, but Bill Gorton was someone I could really enjoy being with, and Mike Campbell was a fun guy despite his drinking problem, so we agreed. Meanwhile, Con and Lady Ashley finished virtually kicking each other. There was some kind of mutual understanding between them. Gorton and I didn't care what it was, and Mike was too drunk to notice. We all went our separate ways on a rainy Parisian night. I walked slowly back to the hotel, while Bill, Mike, and the lady went to their ragtag apartments in Montmartre. Con set off in an unknown direction. I got the impression that a lady was waiting for him somewhere. I actually didn't see Con for quite a while after that. Monaco is a full day's drive down the A6 and A7 from Paris. Both Bill and Mike shared a used Peugeot 107. There was no way I was going to sit in that tin can for 9 hours, so I bought a Range Rover Vogue for the road trip. I told them I rented it. They wanted to know where I got the money since it costs $1,500 a day to rent this car. I told them that I had a rich uncle who died and left me enough money for one gross luxury. I arranged accommodation in Hermitage but didn't want the guys to know how rich I was, so I told them I'd sleep in my car in the mountains. I didn't feel bad about lying to them. My money is no one's business but my own. They stayed on a boat with their friend. I dropped them off at the water taxis, which raced towards the moored boats. I told them I'd see them at Explorer Pub for lunch the next day. It would be an easy walk for them as it is near Port Hercules. We could then plan the 3 days we would spend in the city. I think they sympathized with me because there was no room on the ship, so to speak, but that didn't stop them from leaving me on the pier. The boat they were heading for was slightly smaller than an aircraft carrier. Their Kuwaiti friend must have been swimming in oil money. I pulled up to the Hermitage Hotel, which was only a few minutes' drive from where I had left the boys. Driving through the maze of streets to get to the hotel was a bit tricky, but luckily the French drove on the same side of the road as us. I checked into the hotel. It was only 8 in the evening, so I decided to go down to the Crystal Terrace for a nightcap. Sitting there and looking at the yachts in the Port of Hercules, I thought maybe I should buy one too. I could afford it. I was sipping Parrot when I felt uneasy around me. It was like the way zebras and ostriches on the Serengeti crane their necks when a lion appears. The absolutely beautiful couple caught all the attention. They just appeared on the terrace, holding hands. He was tall and very strong, incredibly handsome, but his partner overshadowed him with her beauty. Even though I had seen her before, I still had to freeze in amazement. She was stunning. Her face and figure were simply exceptional, and she just radiated when she walked. Her partner had one of those I can't believe my eyes moments, followed by a look of pure pleasure. He seemed really happy to see me. They approached the place where I was sitting. He smiled, and she looked as incomprehensibly desirable as always. I smiled friendly, the main thing being to give the impression that I knew they would be here. I suspected this, but I wasn't sure. Now I was. I said, "Have a seat, Robert. Long time no see." I then stood up to offer the lady a chair. As she sat down, she gave me a look that nearly melted the soles of my boat shoes. She said, "Robert told me you were very rich, but I didn't believe it until I saw it for myself." I looked at Robert. He gave a mysterious shrug and said, "My father runs the hedge fund through which your man in Washington invests your money." I sat down and said, "I haven't seen you in forever, buddy." "I guess that's the reason," and nodded towards Lady Brett. She said, "Yes, Robert took me to Ibiza for 3 weeks. We have become much closer to each other." I turned to her. "Have you talked to Mike Campbell recently?" She replied, "The last time I spoke to Mike was the day after you and I met." I told him I was going home to visit my family, and she winked at Con with a seductive smile. I said, "Well, he and Bill Gorton are here for the Grand Prix. I assume you are too. Will this be a problem?" The lady looked at me like I was an idiot. She said, "I really hope so. It was just a temporary whim. He knows it." This was a gray area in the Libertine Code of Conduct. She and Campbell were not married or even in an exclusive relationship, but the lady seemed to act like a honeybee fluttering from flower to flower. I wondered what Con thought about this. Of course, the opportunity to spend 3 weeks in paradise with a woman who looked like Lady Brett was probably worth putting up with her behavior. Besides, Robert was also a bit of a ladies' man. I got the impression that they were suitable for each other. We were sitting and talking when I felt someone else approach the table. It was a woman. She walked over, kissed Lady Brett on the cheek, and hugged KH from behind, squeezing him tightly. He laughed lustfully. She said cheerfully, with an accent that had personal meaning to me, "What a wonderful evening. And who is he?" She nodded in my direction. The fact is that the British have even more pronounced accents than ours, and the mysterious woman spoke with an accent that I knew very well. This is because I studied with them at Cambridge. Whether from Oxbridge or other universities, every female academic in the UK sounds exactly like our guest. It's called received pronunciation, and it literally screams educated British elite. She quickly came up to me and extended her hand. She said, "Britannia Ashley, but everyone calls me Brit. I'm Brett's little sister. Our parents loved alliteration." I shook her hand, blushed, and muttered in response, looking somewhere at her knee level, "Jake Barnes." This was perhaps the most spectacular violation of all the rules of good manners that has ever occurred on the Crystal Terrace, but I'm a nerd, and this woman completely freaked me out. She was just as beautiful as Brett, but in a smaller and less overtly package. Her thick honey blonde hair was cut into a preppy bob with subtle feminine bangs. They framed her oval face perfectly while remaining natural and effortless. Her features were as smooth and proportional as her sister's, but her mouth was wider and full of gaiety. She had the same unusual gray eyes, but unlike Brett, her eyes simply radiated intelligence and a sense of calm. The rest of her was, as they say, impeccably put together. She wasn't as dramatically busty as her sister. Instead, she was long-legged, slender, and panther-like. At first glance, Brett was the more spectacularly attractive of the two, but that was until you compared them side by side and realized that Brett was the complete package: looks, brains, and toughness. Brett was intimacy personified. Britt was much more than that. I was just as stuttering as usual, so I just sat there. Brett said dismissively, "My sister is smart. She studies at Oxford and does something terribly boring. She works too much. We needed to get her away from her dusty computers this weekend so she could have some fun." I looked at Britt, and she actually blushed. She said defensively, "I enjoy working. My sister is the one who likes to have fun." I looked over at Brett. She looked at Con seriously, making hunting eyes. Brett snapped out of her reverie and said to the two of us, "Robert and I need to go up to our room. Will you be able to entertain each other for the rest of the evening?" Without even waiting for an answer, she stood up and began to pull KH towards the exit. I looked at Britt, and she raised her eyebrows in question and said, "Should we get something to drink, or are you leaving too?" I called the waiter over and ordered another Pernod. Britt ordered white wine. Then there was silence. I could actually hear the crickets chirping and the noise of the port a couple of 100 meters in front of us. The silence was getting awkward, so I said, "Sorry, I'm not a very fun person to talk to. I'm not social at all, and I don't know what to say to a woman as beautiful as you." She looked amazed and said, "You think I'm beautiful?" I always considered myself the ugly sister. You have no idea how hard it is to grow up in the shadow of someone like Brett. I said a little too emotionally, I think you are the most beautiful woman I have ever met. Damn, that was exquisite. I understand why Janet couldn't wait to leave me. Britt looked at me thoughtfully and asked the eternal feminine question, are you married? Apparently, she wasn't completely put off by me. I replied, trying to remain calm, I was married, but she chose someone better. Britt looked sympathetic and even covered my hand with hers. It was like electricity. I hadn't thought about women for over a year, but her touch reminded me of how it happens. She said sincerely, it must have been very painful. I replied, I don't know if it can be called pain. It was more like humiliation. I'm now in the wild world. I don't trust anyone anymore. Damn, that was too much information. I've talked too much, so I added, enough about my psychological state. What are you doing at Oxford? This question perked her up noticeably. She spent the next 15 minutes telling me with great enthusiasm about her research. Needless to say, Lady Britt Ashley was an accomplished scientist. This state of affairs was too ideal to be plausible. It's not by chance that ordinary people meet wonderful travel companions with a casual interest in programming and a handy sister to hook you up with. I fell into silence again. She looked at me with some concern and said, what happened? I was going to respond with the usual nothing, but then it dawned on me that I had a better way to distract her while I mentally tried to figure out how to leave. I said, your sister is a very interesting woman. She looked disgusted and said, interesting is one way of putting it. Brett has no sense of morality. The only way she can tell right from wrong is if she feels good after she does something. She's always been wild, but her extreme cuteness gets her out of situations that would ruin most women. Any man who gets involved with her will be hurt. She looked at me with sudden alarm and said, I hope you are not one of her many admirers. I laughed and said, I'm no one's fan. I gave up on women the moment my ex-wife betrayed me. I'm actually not a big fan of humanity in general. She looked sad and said, so, you have no one close? Don't you have anyone? I looked at her open, sincere face and almost said, maybe you, but I knew it could lead to something more, and I knew I couldn't handle it. In fact, old Lucifer has been dead since that fateful day. I realized that this was psychological, not physiological, but I simply had no control over my reactions. I was rational enough to admit that Janet was damaged and that there were probably decent women in the world whom I could trust and love. But another part of me knew for sure that every woman I met would eventually betray me. Plus, who am I to expect a better outcome? I'm sure every one of the lemmings at the Stade de France was also confident that they would succeed. So, in a way, it was a blessing. I had no lustful impulses. I could enjoy life without trying to please anyone but myself, and company with a woman was just an unnecessary distraction. However, I still had memories and remembered how good it was when Janet and I were together. I just knew how the story ended, and I just couldn't write a different ending. So no, I wasn't going to start anything with this amazing woman, even if there was the slightest chance that it was real, that I sincerely believed it. She was too perfect. I stood up and said, this was the best night I've had in the last year, and you're an amazing person. I hope we meet tomorrow. Then I turned and walked back to the elevators in my room. I glanced over my shoulder as I opened the patio door. Lady Britt was still sitting there. She looked both sad and disappointed. It seemed as if she was hoping for something more. Poor woman. I had a moment of regret. I wish I had met her on that hot veranda 7 years ago. Maybe my life would have turned out differently. But at the same time, she was beautiful, and what would she ever see in a nerd like me? The next day was as clear and sunny as the Mediterranean can be. I met the guys at the Explorer pub as we had agreed. Both of them were suffering from crippling hangovers. I didn't feel particularly hungry either. The conversation with Lady Britt had brought back many unpleasant memories, and I tossed and turned all night and could not sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about her, and it was an attraction. Her soul spoke to me. Janet shared many of the same traits, at least the person I knew as Janet. But Lady Britt was much more. She embodied every quality I could ever hope to find in a woman or wife. She seemed to have all the qualities that I had always valued in another person: warmth and compassion, intelligence, fullness of life, hard work, and apparently honesty. They don't make people like that anymore, so she was probably perfectly prepared. I decided that Khan was the devil himself. It was stupid to think that way, especially since I was standing outside looking in, but I couldn't turn off the switch in my head. The Kuwaiti man who invited the guys onto his boat was with them. He was a smooth, plump little man who was 20 years older than me. It was clear that he had some previous connections with Bill and possibly Mike, and he acted as if he owed them something. I didn't ask. However, this guy had some serious money, and he secured access to the pits for carb day. Since no modern racer uses conventional suction, carb day is just a term. In the old days, this was when they manually tuned the car for the racetrack. Now everything is so computerized that they configure the settings on board from a workstation in the pits. But Saturday also determines the relative position on the grid. The Mercedes, Williams, Ferrari, Renault, and McLaren teams were all busy around us, trying to get that last micro advantage for their drivers, and the drivers pushed their cars to get ahead. The Monaco Grand Prix has been held since 1929. The proximity of buildings, streetlights, and other obstacles makes this event so dangerous that the course would never have been certified if it were not the original route. Consequently, whoever starts first usually finishes first in the narrow streets of Monte Carlo, especially because racers reach speeds of almost 200 miles per hour on a straight line near the water. So there was probably more drama going on in the pits today than there will be tomorrow. As the four of us stood against the wall of the pits, the sound of the racers revving those high-tech engines and the Doppler effect of the cars whizzing past on the narrow city streets was absolutely breathtaking. The engines on these cars are limited to 1.6 L. This is about 100 cubic inches in American measurements, or the displacement of a large Harley-Davidson motorcycle engine. However, the average Harley engine produces 80 to 120 horsepower. These engines produce between 600 and 750 horsepower. How they did it was what interested me, not the race itself. I watched a technician from the Williams team tuning one of their Mercedes engines. I hesitate to call him a mechanic because he only used computer equipment. At that moment, Khan and the Ashley sisters entered the pits. I looked back, and Mike and Bill were talking to the Kuwaiti. I thought, damn, this is going to be awkward. As they headed to the center of the boxing area, Khan and Lady Brett came into Campbell's line of sight. I saw him do a double take, then he instantly made the calculation. At that moment, he puffed up like a ruffled black grouse and rushed in their direction. Both Bill and I ran after him. When he got to KH, he spun him around and punched him in the side of the head, which knocked Khan off his feet. We arrived as Khan began to rise to answer Campbell. This could get ugly. I grabbed Khan's hand and said, "Don't do anything stupid. The police are here. He's not worth it." Bill and half the people around him held Mike back. The Kuwaiti arrived at about the same time as the gendarmes. There were a lot of heated conversations. I couldn't hear anything because, at that moment, a long line of cars drove by. When the noise died down, I saw Bill, security, and the Kuwaiti leading Mike out of the pits toward the harbor. Bill seemed to have him in a grip. While he did this, I looked at Khan and his two women. Brett wavered between entertainment and interest. Britt was terrified, and KH rubbed the side of his head, looking annoyed. I said to Brett, "I thought you said it wouldn't be a problem." She said in her bored, noble tone, "I didn't think Mike would act like a child. I'm done with him. He needs to accept it." I thought, what a self-centered expletive. I wondered if she ever actually told Mike herself. A little voice in my head whispered, "They're all like that." I turned to KH. "Are you okay?" He grinned defiantly and said, "I've been beaten even harder. I just didn't expect it." Britt looked at me strangely. She said, "It was very nice of you to intervene. It must have been difficult for you. I see you hate physical violence." I smiled sheepishly and said, "I'm a nerd. I've never been in a real fight in my life." I walked up to the barrier to pull myself together. Britt came and stood quietly next to me. As soon as the two lovers finished tormenting each other, they approached the barrier. One of the Scuderia Ferrari drivers passed us. As they did, The driver made a quick maneuver inside the track, following the McLaren he was chasing, and passed it within a few feet of us on the other side of the Armco. It was either incredibly brave or completely reckless, depending on your point of view. Still, it was a driver's masterpiece. The man in the cockpit must have been a grandmaster of the sport. The racer waved at us in apology as his shockwave nearly knocked us off our feet. He reappeared 2 minutes later while we were still recovering. He drove up the pit track, accelerating the engine, and as he slowed, suddenly turned into the Ferrari pits. The mechanics helped him unfasten and remove his helmet. I heard Lady Brett sigh. If she was the very essence of feminine beauty, then the guy in the cockpit was her exact male counterpart. Damn, he was beautiful. He walked up to where we stood, his eyes never leaving Lady Brett's. Despite all the laws of logic, he must have noticed her as he rushed past us at 80 miles per hour. Racers are said to have exceptional vision and reflexes. This was certainly proof of that. Brett was truly impressive, though Khan was furious. I didn't blame him. He smiled charmingly at us all and said in heavily accented English, "Sorry about the tight passage. I was on my qualifying lap trying to pass this fool. He wasn't great, but no race does. He looked like a Calvin Klein model, only maybe slimmer and better looking. He had that classic 3-day stubble that must have been itchy under his helmet. He was also about 20 years old. He had big, soulful brown eyes and that pale-skinned curly hair that all truly beautiful Iberians have. In fact, he was like a smaller, slimmer version of a young Antonio Banderas. It is not surprising that women threw themselves at his feet." He turned and extended his hand to Brett, introducing himself. "My name is Pedro Romero. I may be Spanish, but I ride for the Italians. What's your name, beauty?" Brett seemed to be elated as she extended her hand and mumbled breathlessly, "Lady Brett Ashley." If anything could enhance her accent, it was this moment. Khan wrapped his arm around her and extended his other hand to Romero. "And I'm Robert Khan, sorry, but we can't stay. We have a meeting." He then began to pull Brett toward the exit, leaving me, Britt, and Romero standing there in disbelief. It was definitely a rude departure, and I'm sure Romero understood why. With his looks and profession, I imagine he received this kind of treatment quite often from jealous husbands, lovers, and boyfriends. I extended my hand and said, without further ado, "Jake Barnes. This is Lady Britt Ashley, Brett's sister." Since the guy had problems with English, I did not try to explain to him the meaning of alliteration. He looked at Britt, and I could see how he was sizing her up. The problem was that he came to the same conclusion as me. Britt was more attractive than Brett. If he had been a Sparrow missile, I would have heard his target lock signal loud and clear. His behavior completely changed. He did everything except not blink in her direction. Like Pepe Le Pew, he said somewhat too politely, "I am very pleased to meet such a beautiful woman. Would you like to see what's behind our boxes? It is very interesting." She replied, "Thank you. Can Jake come with us?" It was a stupid question. He looked at me, put on his most sincerely sorry face, and said, "No, sorry, but I can only bring one guest at a time." My jealousy sensor went off the charts. Damn it, what were these feelings? It was like a paralyzed man who suddenly finds his legs itching like crazy. Britt looked sorry. She said, "Then I will have to decline your kind invitation, but you might want to join us for drinks after you finish work for the day. We're having a little party on the Crystal Terrace tonight at 7. She smiled sweetly at Romero, then took me by the arm, turned around, and immediately began to drag me towards the exit of the pits. My heart was filled with joy. Boy, I had forgotten about the emotions a woman could evoke. This stunning and polite lady had just chosen to stay with me instead of leaving with the most handsome racer in the universe. I wondered what episode of The Twilight Zone I was in. It was both exciting and incredibly scary to realize the depth of feelings I had for Lady Britt Ashley. My first instinct was to ruthlessly suppress them, but Britt was nothing if not kind and polite to me. I wasn't going to reward her show of respect by acting like a jerk. However, I made a promise to myself to never get burned again, and this woman was walking through fire. As we walked, she chatted with me in her fruity academic accent about how technicians adjust fuel and ignition timing parameters wirelessly using onboard propulsion systems. It was alarming. She seemed to be completely oblivious to the fact that the prettiest man in the world had just proposed to her, or perhaps handsome, bold, and glamorous meant nothing to her. It was so long ago that I almost didn't recognize this feeling. The effect was about the same as if someone had come out of a 14-month coma. Meanwhile, she continued to talk to me in techie language, and I could not take my eyes off her beautiful face. When we got back to the hotel, I called Gordon. He said Campbell had been drinking all day. I told him about the party and suggested that he keep Mike out of there. Britt stood with me in the hall. I looked at my watch, and we had an hour to change. I asked her if she wanted to have something to drink on the patio. She noted that a woman needs a lot of time and preparation to look effortless, so she said she should go up to her room and do some girly business. I felt disappointed. I think it was noticeable. She gently touched my cheek. It was the first time I had been touched like that since I kissed Janet that historic morning. I think the pain showed on my face because Britt said, "We have to talk about this tonight, Jake. I want to know what you think." This had about 1,000,000 interpretations. I would normally run away from the scene, but I was hopelessly caught in her web. So instead, I smiled and said, "See you at 7. As I was shaved, showered, and sauntered out onto the patio at exactly 7, it was like I was back in high school hoping Beverly Johnson would be at the dance. The patio was huge, but the people Con met had reserved a fenced-off area for the entertainment of a select group of guests. I was everything but elite. I was there because Britt invited me, but Romero was there too. As Romero approached, a gorilla holding a velvet rope led him into the party. After all, he was a big star. He wasn't as helpful when I approached, so I stayed in the public area waiting for Con or Britt to notice me and invite me. I wasn't as offended as you might think. I'm used to being excluded from something. However, watching the stars having fun in their own special little territory was a valuable lesson for me. Despite all signs of common sense, I began to think about Britt. She seemed so good, kind, smart, and caring, and she was a magnificent English rose. She had graceful style and a heartbreakingly attractive sense of self. Her natural honesty and decency only made her even more beautiful, and since all that attractiveness came from her soul and not just from her stunning face and body, I knew that she would retain the same beauty when she was 88 years old. I couldn't imagine her living with Romero. She was too classy for someone unlike him. And he was several years younger, but I wouldn't blame her if she tried it over the weekend. After all, he was a walking symbol, and then there was me. I had already started seeing a woman who was a relative equal to me in society. I couldn't imagine how awkward it would be to go out with a world-class beauty like Britt. Finally, I saw her standing with KH and Brett at the side of the buffet table. She radiated energy, intelligence, and wit. For the event, she was dressed casually in a lightweight silk floral dress that highlighted her modest yet gorgeous cleavage and perfectly shaped legs. She wore one of those hats and veils that only upper-class English women can pull off, but it was her body in the tight silk dress that spoke most eloquently to me. She looked excited as Romero advanced toward her like a cruise missile, with her at the center of Pyongyang. They started talking, and he stood about 6 inches away from her. She looked a little uncomfortable but didn't step back. She laughed and held his hand. I assumed she was expressing interest. I shouldn't have felt anything. Their attraction was natural, she was gorgeous, and so was he. But the problem was that I really felt it, and it really hurt. I was disgusted with myself. How could I have let my guard down so much? I muttered under my breath, "This is a lesson I won't soon forget." I was determined to get as far away from beautiful people as possible when Romero said something to Britt and nodded in my direction. I waved at her weakly, a farewell gesture. She looked at me with genuine anger. I thought, oh damn, she thinks I'm interfering with her little exciting moment with Romero. So I turned sharply and walked out the terrace door. I was angry with myself. An entire year of treatment was tossed into the trash because I was too weak and stupid to follow my own rules. I was too upset to just sit in my room, so I headed to the Explorer pub. I was almost sure I would find Bill and Mike there. I restored my protective screens and prepared for what the Klingon could throw at me. All 3 were on the terrace overlooking the inner harbor. This place was the only deep water port on the Côte d'Azur and had been there since Hercules was around. Bill was glad to see me. I think one of the reasons was that Mike looked like he needed some control tonight. I had no reason to sympathize with Mike since I had no rights to another sister, but honestly, getting drunk sounded like a great idea. Mike continued to tell us what he would do to KH when he got his hands on him. I finally said, "Look, Mike, it's not KH's fault. Brett is just that kind of woman. You can't change her. You need to let her go, or she will destroy your soul. And if it's any consolation, KH will end up in the same situation as you once she gets tired of him." What I really wanted to say was, don't waste your time on a narcissistic like Brett, but I knew for sure that this would start a fight. I was also thinking about my unfortunate situation with Britt. I understood that Britt was not like her sister, but the prospect of seeing her and Romero locked in a sweaty embrace a couple of hours later didn't do me any good either. I had a few beers with them while we talked. It was a stimulating time spent in ideal conditions, getting an education in Formula One racing. I was born and raised in NASCAR country, and the idea of Italians, Germans, French, and Brits racing down picturesque European streets in miniature cars seemed pretty funny to me. It wasn't until I saw these cars in action that Dale Jr.'s Chevrolet suddenly seemed tame and underpowered. Both Bill and the Kuwaiti were betting on the upcoming race, and it turned out that Romero was at the top of the list of potential winners. I knew he would be a big winner tonight, which was enough for me. The conversation wasn't helping because Campbell kept coming back to how Brett had hurt him. I finally said, "Grow up, Mike. You have to learn to let go of the things that are hurting you." I was actually talking to myself. Campbell jumped out of his chair as if he was going to hit me. I managed to dodge, and Bill grabbed him in the same grip he had used earlier in the day. He quickly said, "Thank you for the evening, Ollie. See you back on the boat," and led his friend out, muttering, "Come on, you stupid." Ollie looked at me, and I smiled sadly and said, "You need to help him understand that he can't make something happen that just can't happen." I was talking to myself again. He said, "I'll try, my friend. In the meantime, please join us on my boat tomorrow. You are more than welcome. And by the way, bring with you this beautiful woman who is so passionate about you." I asked in surprise, "What beautiful woman?" I didn't remember a single beautiful woman in my life, at least not one who was ever infatuated with me. He said, "Lady Brett's sister, of course. Is there anyone else?" His tone suggested he thought I was joking. I just sat there stunned. I said, "Why do you say that?" "She is undoubtedly somewhere very intimately involved with Pedro Romero right now." Ollie laughed and said, "If she is with him, it is only because you let her go." He then stood up, threw a couple of €100 on the table, and left. I was still thinking about his words when my phone rang. I thought it was Bill telling me about Mike's condition. Instead, it was the only other person in Monte Carlo who had my phone number, KH, who sounded worried. He said, "You need to meet me in the hall immediately," then hung up. Damn it, Romero took Britt away. I figured he'd seduce her tonight, but kidnapping? I crossed the street, dodging the furious Monaco traffic. This was a situation that required all hands on deck, and I was in a panic. I even remembered thinking, I thought Britt was such a noble woman. I'm such a fool. They're all the same. When I walked through the door, KH was nervously pacing the hall like a trapped animal. I ran up to him and said breathlessly, "Robert, where is she? I'll kill him if he hurts her." He looked concerned and said, "It's Brett. She's disappeared. I think she's with that guy Romero." At that moment, a concerned voice came from behind me. "Jake, are you okay? Where have you gone?" I turned around, and there she stood, looking at me with concern. She was the epitome of beauty and elegance. It was instant. The protective screens exploded, the walls collapsed, and I was unconditionally in the game with this woman. I realized this sounds stupid, but seeing her like this made my heart soar. If love is a feeling of absolute connection, then I was truly and unconditionally in love with her. Britt is very smart. She instantly understood the situation. I didn't need to say a word to explain myself. I saw compassion and understanding on her face. I also noticed something else. I said, "I thought you were with Romero." She looked shocked and said, "Why would I be with him?" "I was waiting for you to come back after you ran away." She seemed calm but worried. She clearly knew what I was thinking and gave me the benefit of the doubt over my lack of trust in her. I looked into those intelligent gray eyes, confused, and said, "It doesn't matter. We can talk later." Then I turned back to Robert and asked, "How can we help?" He said, "You left, and Britt went looking for you. When she didn't return, I went out to see where she was. She said she was waiting for you here, so I came back, and Romero and Brett were both gone. That's when I called you." I was still struggling with my emotions. Britt was waiting for me, but I said, "Let's think about it. There are only two places they could go, the motorhome that follows these guys from race to race, or the pits themselves." I thought Romero was going to use the same trick on Brett that he had tried to use on Britt earlier that day. Only, I was sure Brett would be an easier target. The last thing I wanted was for Romero and Brett to be discovered having intimacy, so I said, "Why don't you check out his motorhome? They're most likely there. There's a comfortable bed there." I knew we would find them in the pits, but by sending KH elsewhere, I hoped to prevent his arrest for the murders of both of them. He said, "Yes, this sounds right. I'll meet you here as soon as I find her," and he rushed away. I turned to Britt and said, "I thought you and Romero would be together tonight, that's why I left. I couldn't bear the thought of you being with him." She looked surprised and cheerful. She said, "Why did you even think I might be interested in that boy? Is that woman there even interesting to you?" She pointed to one of the heavily busty, scantily clad women who had just left a party on a yacht in the harbor. I said, "God no, there's probably not a part of her body that hasn't been artificially enhanced. I like women who are real, and I might add, with a bit above room temperature. I may be a typical man, but I need to somehow connect with a person before I want to get close to them." She laughed cheerfully and said, "My thoughts are exactly the same. Romero is not someone I would ever contact in that way." We walked hand in hand to the pits. I was absolutely sure we would find them there. It was a wonderful night, the temperature was ideal, with light breezes carrying the delicate scent of flowers from the hills. After the day's chaos and intensity, it was peaceful in the pits. There were still mechanics quietly working on the cars in the illuminated shelters. Behind the pits, there were also guards everywhere. Most of them recognized us from that day, but I think it was Britt's beauty that actually gave us a free pass. A beautiful woman can achieve a lot with French and Italian guards. We walked past the Ferrari pits and headed towards the temporary sheds where extra tires and spare parts were stored. I was glad Britt was with me because I knew I would need her help with her sister. I wasn't afraid of Romero, he might have been a champion behind the wheel, but I was almost half a foot taller and 100 pounds heavier. However, I thought that if we interrupted Brett halfway through, I would need Britt's help to pry her claws off me. We quietly opened the barn door and heard what was happening. I felt uneasy. Meanwhile, Britt stood nearby, looking as calm as Wellington at Waterloo. She had either seen something like this before or was just so calm. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have a garden hose to use like I do with dogs at home, and they didn't offend anyone except perhaps Romero. The problem was that he suddenly appeared right behind us. He apparently realized that I was trying to send him on a wild goose chase and followed us. He took one look at Romero and rushed past us, hitting Romero in the ribs with his shoulder. It was something he must have done to countless Princeton and Yale quarterbacks during his years playing for Harvard. Romero let out a cry of pain, flew into the air, and landed on his back several feet away. If he wasn't completely unconscious, he was clearly dazed. He looked absurd lying there, not moving. The entire time, Britt and I stood side by side, stunned. I was ashamed of both of them. I had no other ideas except a strong desire to get out of there. We turned around and left, closing the door behind us. We silently walked back to the hotel. When we arrived in the hall, Britt sharply turned to face me. There was a serious and determined look on her face as she said those anxious 5 words, "Jake, we need to talk." I replied sincerely, "I know. Where do you want to do it?" The obvious place for privacy was my room, but that was far from the context we both wanted to create. I said, "I heard that the exotic garden is a good place to sit at night if you want to be alone." She said, "Thank you." It didn't sound as strange as it might have seemed. She thanked me for not inviting her to my room to look at my engravings. I parked the Evoque in a small lot down the street from the garden entrance. It was relatively quiet and peaceful as we entered the garden and walked down the terraces to a place where we could sit and look out over the Mediterranean Sea and Monaco. To the left, the sky was a deep purple with a million stars interspersed. The Mediterranean at night is a special place. The silence and beauty of the surroundings were breathtaking. We found a bench. She sat down next to me, turning towards me but not touching me. She wasn't unfriendly, she just wanted some space. This wasn't about romance, it was supposed to be a serious conversation between two intelligent people. I recognized the similarities in our approach. We both handled things the same way. I said, "When I saw you with Romero, it almost killed me. I don't really know you, and I was afraid you might turn out like your sister." In retrospect, I sincerely regret ever entertaining that thought. She said, "Your mistake is clear. He really did harass me while you were watching us." This was probably reflected in his gestures. I kept pushing him away to make room, but he continued to force himself on me. "I didn't know you came until he pointed at me. I can imagine what you were thinking about what was going on between him and me, and that made me angry. He was clearly trying to give you that impression. Then you ran away without giving me a chance to explain. I was looking for you, but you had already disappeared. So I just sat in the hall and waited. I knew you would return sooner or later. Then Robert came along, and you know the rest. Why are you so upset? I would have approached you as soon as I knew you were here. Does this have anything to do with that cloud that always hangs over you?" I said, "I came home from work one afternoon, and my wife of 5 years simply announced that she was leaving me for the man she had been having an affair with for 6 months. I trusted her, and I didn't see it coming. Since that day, I have had no confidence in the moral character or integrity of anyone, especially women. I never get close enough to anyone to let them prove otherwise. I don't want to be like this, alienated. It's just the way I am and have been for the last 14 months. I came to France to try to repair the damage done to my self-esteem. I needed to gain a new understanding of who I am in a healthier direction in life. I thought I was starting to recover, but then I saw you and Romero interacting the way you were, and it was déjà vu. I couldn't bear the pain, so I went looking for Bill and Mike. Mike is that poor unfortunate guy who gave his heart to Brett. I thought I knew how he felt. I realized that I was terribly wrong about you, and I'm sorry. I hope we can get to know each other better." She looked at me with wide, glowing eyes. "I sincerely believe that you are an intelligent and balanced woman who is straightforward and honest. You're as different from Brett as I am from Con. Their behavior is not even close to what any of us would consider normal." Then she became deadly serious and asked, "Do you see me in the same light as your ex-wife?" This got me thinking. I said, "Janet was smart, funny, and beautiful, just like you. There was just a fundamental flaw that I didn't notice. In my opinion, you are the ideal woman, beauty, intelligence, and kindness in one package. In the very short time that I have known you, your obvious intelligence and superior sense of self-worth have drawn me to you in a way that I have never experienced in my life. I honestly think you are as real as you seem, but I really can't judge fully until I get to know you better. I would like to try to do this, if you agree." She looked like that was the answer she wanted to hear, because she said, "All my life, I've been Lady Brett Ashley's little sister. No one has ever judged me for who I am or what I do, they just see me as a younger version of Brett, and the last thing I want is to be like her. I have had several lovers, and perhaps I like intimacy more than she does, but there has to be something meaningful between me and a man before I would even consider allowing him into my body. Without a connection, intimacy is just animal behavior. It can be incredible from a hormonal point of view, but this kind of intimacy is no different from the mating behavior of any other species. I like to think that I've evolved a little further than that. I need to feel a person's individuality. This is critical because I need to give myself completely to a man to get real satisfaction. Brett's approach to intimacy without intimacy would destroy my soul. I admit to myself that my jealousy and overprotectiveness, after such a short acquaintance, were insane, but the feeling was there and it was so illogical that it scared me. What was happening to my carefully constructed facade of detached cynicism? Meanwhile, she continued to talk to me as if she didn't realize that I was experiencing terrible attacks of jealousy. She said, I am aware that men find me attractive, and frankly, it's more frustrating than pleasing. I believe that I am much more than just my appearance. I need a man to want me for my mind and my inner being. The problem is that everyone is trying to put me in this cage, even my colleagues. They joke about how my breasts distract men, imagining that being judged solely by the size of the bulge in your pants is what I feel like. I thought to myself, if she tries to minimize her attractiveness, I can't imagine what she would be like if she tried to maximize it. I knew she would be hotter than her sister, and her sister was the hottest woman I've ever met. Britt looked concerned as she said, I have accomplished some significant things in my short academic career, endeavors and achievements that would define a man, and the only recognition I've received so far is that I'm attractive. This is unfair for a person like me and humiliating. I want to be appreciated for who I am, not what I look like. My relationships should be based on a union of equals. I want to build a life with a man based on mutual respect between two like-minded people, not based on my appearance or attractiveness. When I eventually give myself to a man, I plan to do it for life, and that's a long time. Passion will fade, beauty will fade, but there must always be a connection between one man and one woman in order for me to be happy. From the very beginning, I recognized sincerity in you, your desire to see me as a partner and equal, not just your woman, which immediately attracted me to you. You also have a magnificent mind, which I absolutely need in a life partner. Honestly, I wanted to take the next step from the moment we met. I know you have good reasons for mistrust, therefore, I will do everything to make you comfortable and to help you leave the bad experience in the past. But I would like to move forward in our relationship. I promise you won't regret it. All this was said in a neutral tone. It was an exchange of views between two like-minded people. There were no romantic excesses or passionate feelings in the conversation. The main thing was that there was no hint in the subtext of, well, all this is behind us, let's make love, which is often present in such conversations when getting acquainted. This was exactly what I would do if I were looking to make a real connection with another person, and this further strengthened my conviction that Lady Britt Ashley was the woman for me, a special person that I could always trust and share my life with. Isolation and loneliness are not the norm for humans, and I realized that I needed someone, despite all the fake philosophy I used to convince myself otherwise. After everything I had been through, commitment to a woman required me to have complete, unshakable confidence in the constancy of her soul. This smart, honest, and at the same time absolutely charming woman offered to build a relationship with me carefully and thoughtfully, and I was confident that she had the natural intelligence and nobility to take this step. I leaned towards her, and she leaned towards me in the same way. It was literally a magical, mesmerizing moment. There were no fireworks or loud symphonic music, it was simply a complete and unconditional merging of two people. When we kissed, all the missing pieces fell into place, and I became whole again. I would be a complete fool to ignore the significance of this wonderful event. We parted. She had Brett's white-hot inner fire, but it was under strict control. I knew I would see this passion again, but it would only be on her terms and at her chosen time and place. I appreciated that she was in careful control of her attractiveness. No man in his right mind wants a woman who can't control her base instincts. That was the problem with Janet and Brett. Britt's strict self-discipline and moral strength were the two things I loved most about her. I said, as far as I'm concerned, this kiss seals our deal. I can't believe my incredible luck. This has never happened to me before, but the moment I touched your lips, I knew you were the woman for me. I believe you are real, and we can make this work. We didn't make love that first night or even while we were in Monte Carlo. We were actually committed to each other for almost a month before we reached that part of our relationship. We watched the race from a Kuwaiti boat. Romero had a bad day, eventually retreating and complaining of fatigue. Most likely, the cause was bruised ribs. Britt stood out even among other beautiful people, but her exceptional beauty meant nothing to us. We were together in the crowd, constantly exchanging glances as we moved around. She constantly let me know she was next to me, even if she was standing 50 feet away talking to other people. Her strong, loyal companionship was much more valuable than hot intimacy. After 34 years and one failed marriage, I finally experienced what it was like to have a true life partner. I was no longer outside on the porch, she led me inside, and I found peace. The crowd of merry revelers became too much, so I leaned on the boat railing, trying to find some time to myself. She came to lean next to me and nudged me with her shoulder. In my opinion, this playful gesture was much more intimate and meaningful. She looked towards the harbor at the exotic garden and said, "I wish I were there now instead of here." Of course, I was thinking the same thing. For the first time in my life, it was interesting to be associated with someone who shared my interests and views on life. Watching the races was boring, and communicating with rich people was tiring. Brit grew up in the aristocracy, and I am sure that a well-bred young English aristocrat would never shirk her social responsibilities. But as platitudes and empty chatter oppressed my soul, I also felt that her upbringing must have been painful. I had two thoughts. I kept the first one to myself, but I couldn't help but think about her. Really, an English noble lady as beautiful as this woman chose me? I'm clearly living in some kind of Lewis Carroll fairy tale. The second thought was more important. I said, "As bored as I am, aren't you?" She nodded in anticipation and said, "I'd love to be somewhere alone with you, just reading and talking." "Do you like swimming?" I replied, "I love the peace and quiet of being alone on a boat with someone." I didn't ask, but I was pretty sure I couldn't handle the story of her and Sir Percy on Winder. I said, "This is my idea of a perfect day. My ex couldn't sit still long enough to do this, let alone enjoy it. I have a small 32-foot boat that I sail on the Pomac, but my only companion was my old dog, Buster." She laughed and said, "We have a whole life ahead of us, and I'm the best boatswain in the whole fleet, Captain." She stood at attention and gave me the British open palm salute. The mischievous smile on her beautiful face was no less impressive than the movement of her large breasts as she threw her shoulders back. Of course, she had her own plans for the trip, and I had mine, so we parted that evening. I wasn't upset at all. I knew we would be together for the rest of our lives, so our temporary separation only fueled our desire for each other. She flew out of Nice, and I took the guys back to Paris. It then took me a few weeks to get things sorted out at home. The main delay was simply making space for us to live together. Her father was a hereditary count, her mother had died the year before, and Brett had been disinherited years before, so Brit was his only direct heir. Because the rules of succession for the British aristocracy have not changed much since the time of William the Conqueror, Brit could not inherit the earldom, but most of the estate in Gloucestershire passed to her. Her father was still strong and healthy, and unless something unexpected happened, it would be some time before we settled into the Count's house. Neither of us was the typical lord or lady of the manor. Brit did challenging and somewhat pioneering work at Oxford, and she didn't want to give it up. I never would have expected her to. Where I ended up was not the question. With my money, I could live in a yurt in Patagonia, and if Brit had been there, the yurt would have been just fine for me. So Oxford was the logical place. Brit, of course, had her own money too, but I had so much in my bank account earning interest that I offered to buy a place near the university if she decided to move in with me. Or at the very least, I could rent something close enough to her so that we could slowly ease into the relationship. Being a prudent woman, she chose the second option. She said, "I want this to work, and I want to lay a solid foundation before we dive into a relationship. I love you, and I will always love you, but I want to live happily with you for the rest of our lives. Life is something we need to approach thoughtfully." And that, gentlemen, is what fundamentally distinguished Brit from all the other women I've ever known. We talked and texted a lot while we were apart. She called me a couple of weeks after we broke up to tell me there was a vacancy at OLE. If I took her offer, we could work together. This decision took about a nanosecond. The next morning, I checked out of the hotel and headed down the A1 toward Ward's Call. In theory, it's only a 3-hour trip, but given the traffic leaving Paris, it's closer to 4 hours. Accordingly, I didn't reach Douvres until early in the day and reached Oxford only in the evening. I got a number at the Randolph and called her. She expected to hear from me the next day and sounded absolutely ecstatic to hear from me a day early. The contrast with Janet was obvious. It seemed that the time apart had taken its toll on my future wife. This was the complete opposite of Janet's attitude. Janet usually saw separation as an opportunity to pursue other things, whereas, from the tone of Brit's voice, it seemed like the only thing she wanted to do was be with me. We met at the Morse Bar. Yes, Oxford's only 5-star hotel has named its main bar after a TV character. I was sitting in the back bar with its luxurious wood paneling when she walked in through the Beaumont Street entrance. It was a warm, clear evening outside. She must have walked 5 minutes from the A1 down St. Giles to the Randolph. She was dressed in a light silk dress suitable for good weather. The dress accentuated her gorgeous, round like a frame around a Renoir painting. She was looking for me, smiling her mysterious smile. Her face lit up when she saw me. Was it a choir of angels, or were they simply tuning into the evening prayer somewhere? It seemed like we had never been apart. It had been 3.5 weeks since we last saw each other, and she was as charming as always. I sat with 2 Balvenie fingers in front of me. We hugged, and she kissed me on the cheek like a sister and ordered the same. Even after almost a month, it wasn't a big deal. We are not people of big events, anything else would have been different from us. This strengthened our subconscious connection. She simply glowed with energy and happiness. I said, "Working late, honey?" She replied, "I wanted to finish all the work on the project. For the rest of the week, I'm going to spend a lot of time getting to know you better, so to speak." There was no doubt what she meant. We spent a polite and courteous period discussing the news. We wanted to make our hasty exit from the bar and up to my room dignified, if not entirely subtle. Soon after, I lay waiting on the bed. She left the bathroom and walked into the dim light of the drawn curtains. Those long, muscular legs carried her in that feminine way that women run. She arrived in a hurry and landed next to me, laughing. She positioned herself so that she was lying on her back on the bed, simply looking up at me. I lay next to her, leaning on one elbow, and looked into her infinitely deep and beautiful gray eyes, seeing in them the play of intelligence and strength like summer lightning on a wide prairie. I also saw her immeasurable passion waiting there like a ferocious predator. I felt her gaze pulling me toward her with that feminine power that is the essence of a woman, embracing and restoring the strength of her mind and her absolute humanity. This feeling in itself spoke volumes about the depth of her soul and the reservoirs of passion she was willing to share with the right person. I have known many women in my life, but I have never participated in such a display of attractiveness as I just witnessed. I didn't even want to talk to her about normal things. All I wanted to do was worship her. There is something at the core of all men's brains that knows the survival of the species depends on female attractiveness. This is probably why the religions of all primitive societies are built around female goddesses. Brit just proved how deeply and powerfully fundamental her beauty is. I'm sure if she had performed like that in front of our primitive ancestors, they would have run and carved an idol in her honor. Since I was the only man present, all I could do was look at her in complete bewilderment and say with admiration, "This incredible woman is mine." It was a true association of equals. She is a wonderful woman and the most passionate lover you can imagine, but her physical charms pale in comparison to her dedication to facing whatever life throws at us, never leaving my side. We have experienced many events in our lives, but there is only one person who has experienced all of them with me, and that is her. The real reward of our marriage lies in the intimate sharing of these moments. We've gone through trials and rewards, always side by side. We are like Arctic bulls in the face of any opponent, standing back to back with horns pointing outward, each protecting the other's back from the wolves. The incredible luck of meeting and marrying this woman, whom I still consider head and shoulders above me, is a once-in-a-lifetime event. But let's say that's the lesson. The truth is that your life is no more meaningful or significant than the sum of the people who are part of it. This is something I've always missed in all my philosophical musings. In reality, we are all just getting through life without a script, and we never know when some random person or event will swoop in and redefine everything. Success lies in nothing more than the ability to recognize the significance of a thing when it appears and then boldly act on this understanding. That's what happened with Brit and me. We weren't sure where the significant events in Monte Carlo would lead, but we definitely realized that each of us is important to the other, and we took the necessary steps to strengthen our bond. We then worked long and hard over all these years to make this connection last. I lived a happy life until my 50th birthday. During this time, Brett and Con married each other twice. I heard that they decided to officially register an open marriage. As I said before, they deserve each other. Gordon and Campbell returned to the States. I wished both of these old Marines good luck. Romero became a 2-time Formula One world champion and also won W Indy. I wished him good luck too. I actually won a real prize. We've been married for almost 16 years, and in my eyes, my wife is as fresh and beautiful as the day we met in Monte Carlo. But now she shares the love of my life with our beautiful Brooke. You're right, we continued the theme of alliteration. Brooke has been my pride and joy and partner in crime since the moment she was born. Her beauty and intelligence match her mother's, although she is only 14 years old. We live on part of the estate that Brit's father gave us in trust. Inheritance taxes here are huge. I built our house to match the Earl's castle or whatever they call it, with almost 30 bedrooms. The main difference is that our heating and plumbing are 4 centuries more modern. I'm not a fan of being outside, but it's fun to look at my 200 acres of land. Both my girls like to ride horses, so they have a lot of space for horse activities. Brooke is part of the Excel Talent Development Program, a program that trains potential young Olympians. She rides a chestnut horse that looks so noble and majestic that her previous job must have been leading the charge of the Light Brigade. And 14-year-old Brooke manages it with the same imperturbable calm as Lord Cardigan himself. Like many members of the British nobility, Brit is an accomplished horsewoman. This is one of the many things she does better than mere mortals like me. She controls her sullen black stallion with the same firmness, tenderness, and grace that she controls everything else in her life, and he reacts to her like a little dog coming to life, although I swear I've seen him blow off steam sometimes. More fittingly, I had one last call with the woman who made my life possible. I would like to tell you about this. Brit's father has a world-class collection of French Impressionists, which he was persuaded to lend to the guys from Corin. Brit and I went to start collecting. Brit was there to represent her father. The Earl and I agreed because I love her and didn't want to spend time away from her. I sold the flat a long time ago when I retired and became an English squire, so we stopped in Madison on the 15th. While we were in Washington, I stood at the gruesome opening, showing that places like Corin always put on events the night before to make wealthy donors feel pampered. For the Count's daughter, Brit had gone off to do her noble work. I was in the far corner, pressed up against the most beautiful girl in the room. She was wearing an elegant navy blue cocktail dress, 4-inch heels, and her hair was styled like a grown woman's. I was holding a glass of scotch, and she was holding something with strawberries and lemonade. My wife finds my protective attitude towards our little girl ridiculously cute, but now that Brooke is turning into an even more stunning version of Brit, I'm starting to think about a monastery on a remote island. On the other hand, Brooke shares her mother's exceptional intelligence and self-esteem, so I guess I'll have to settle for her navigating the waters of young womanhood as skillfully as her mother. She will always have a supremely sensible mother to turn to if she ever needs advice. Brooke must be the only teenager on the planet who thinks her parents are cool. I attribute this to Brit's stern but loving upbringing, as well as the fact that Brooke and I both regularly get into trouble with Brit due to some criminal misadventure we've just committed. My role is to teach her to be self-sufficient and courageous. We stood in front of gas. Brooke spoke very seriously and knowledgeably about working with a brush. I looked at Brit, and that's when I noticed Worm and Janet entering the building. As major donors, the people of Corin held them in high regard and wanted to pay their respects to the Earl's daughter. I thought to myself, of course you can always count on people like them to show up at a high-profile event like this. I thought Janet was actually going to curtsy to Brit when she was introduced. Worm's expression was more reminiscent of carnal lust. It was obvious he had a wandering eye. Brit glanced at me as they were introduced, caught the name, and I nodded. She went into full aristocracy mode. It was an incredible transformation. My smart, funny, and practical wife could teach Queen Elizabeth I a thing or two about class superiority and imperial behavior. The words royal and aloof come to mind. The three of them talked for a couple of minutes. Janet looked both astounded and starstruck, while Worm tried to look into Brit's little black dress. Brit then turned with the two of them and led them across the room toward me and Brooke. They looked puzzled. The years had not been kind to Janet. She looked older than her real age and had a restless, nervous manner. Meanwhile, Worm was in full seduction mode with Brit. They both looked completely stunned when they got close enough to notice who Brit was leading them to. It was as if I had jumped up from the floor like the devil himself. Janet said, with deep condescension oozing from her voice, "Why, Jake, what are you doing at such an event? This is not your type of audience." The worm looked at me as if I were something he had just walked into and said, "Yeah, that's too cultured for you, isn't it? Don't you feel a little out of place?" I said cheerfully, "Hello to you too. It's been a long time, hasn't it? What a difference 16 years and a good woman make." I added, "You're right, events like this really bore me. I'm just here to support my wife." Janet asked with slightly jaded interest, "Oh, your wife is on the committee that organizes this event?" I replied, "Not really." Their faces again looked like they couldn't understand why Britt had brought them to talk to someone like me. I added, "I came here mainly to introduce my daughter to Washington society." They both turned to Brooke, who was standing next to me with an arrogant look that was perhaps even more arrogant than the one Henry Romanoff gave his ex-wife. They said simultaneously and with complete surprise, "Is she your daughter?" I must admit that Brooke was a strikingly beautiful young woman in her grown-up dress and heels, and her developing body made her look about 25. I said, "Yes, meet Lady Brooke Ashley Barnes." You could see them doing the math in their heads. Janet then turned to Britt with complete bewilderment, "Is Jake your husband?" I smiled and said, 16 wonderful years already." Britt walked up to Brooke and me, lovingly took my hand, and said, "Jake and I met in Monte Carlo, and from the minute I saw him, I adored him. We live on an estate in Gloucestershire, but we still work part-time at GCHQ in Cheltenham. Our daughter goes to school in Dean Close." Brooke, who clearly didn't appreciate the way Janet and Worm were treating me, said in her most aristocratic tone, with her lip curled up, "Yeah, only the best people get ready there. Ordinary people like you don't qualify." I understood what she was doing. Brooke usually sounds like her mother rather than Princess Diana. Both Janet and Worm looked absolutely stunned. I couldn't help myself. I turned to the treacherous Worm and, with all the fake sincerity I could muster, said, "You were right, Janet. I would never have had this wonderful life if it weren't for you, so thank you from the bottom of my heart." Janet understood. She didn't like it, but she understood. Then I turned to the two most beautiful women in the world and said, "We have accomplished our mission here. Don't you think it's time to leave?" Britt smiled at me with her beaming smile and said in her deep Belgravian accent, "Of course, dear. It's really tiring being around all these boring pretenders." The implication was clear. Worm and his companion were rejected. My two loves took me by the arms, and we turned to leave, but not before I stole a glance at Janet. She looked at her companion with complete desperation, while he looked lustfully at Britt's. Her look of utter disgust and contempt was priceless. I thought to myself, George Herbert was right, living well is truly the best revenge. This story reminds us that even after the most painful betrayal, we can find the strength to move on and find true love. In the end, it doesn't matter how badly we were hurt, it's how we heal that matters. And remember, life is always ready to give a second chance to those who are not afraid to take it. Thank you for staying with us. See you again.